Welcome to Talk Universe. This is our show for Wednesday, September 7th, 2016. I'm your host, Sir Charles Schultz. Tonight's subject is a really fascinating one, and people have been wanting me to get to this one. And it is when virtual worlds collide with reality. We're going to cover how that's possible, what virtual worlds are all about, and where we're going with the technology. This is perhaps one of the most interesting subjects we have because many people are aware that virtual worlds are basically constructions that we have that we've been creating early on in the form of simulations and mathematical models, later in the form of video games, and now they're really full-blown environments. There have been a number of virtual worlds around for years, and we're going to look at exactly how a fake or fabricated world can run head-to-head with the real world and what the consequences of that might be. So what is a virtual world? Well, many years ago, when predicting the weather or building a spacecraft was an extremely difficult and time-intensive process, computing got introduced into the mix, and it made it much easier to create models of things that, from a mathematical standpoint, acted in many ways as a real-world model would. And it allows us to test things without actually having to build expensive hardware that might be destroyed in the process. One of the advantages to a simulation is that we can redefine the size, the weight, the speed of something on the fly. We literally can type the numbers in the keyboard, and the computer can change the parameters of the model to match what we want. It's like having something made out of Play-Doh or silly putty, and you can stretch it, shape it, change it, and get its properties to match whatever you need, and then run the test on it without destroying it. Or you can determine if the test would destroy it. Early models were things such as hurricanes for weather simulation, and we made models of the Earth's atmosphere, and we tested them and we found how realistic they are. Now, those models aren't the real thing, and yet, to some degree, they act enough like the real thing that we can accept that the outcome of the test, using the model in the virtual space, will be enough like reality that it's useful. We can predict where the hurricane will move to a certain degree of accuracy. We know what fuels it and how to defuse it if we had to. And in some cases, we check systems, complicated systems like engines or oxygen systems or even biological systems. And we can build models of those in the computer, and we can test them. At the same time, there was a great deal of interest in computer games, because if you can create simulations of this sort, you can also mix them with the gaming world and create very interesting and engaging computer games. When we reach the stage where we have games that multiple people can play in, and it has some of the properties of a world that is consistent, we term that it is a virtual world. And virtual reality is basically a synthetic reality. Some video games classify as virtual reality. Normally, you don't call it a virtual reality unless you have the ability to interact with other people or characters within that space. And some of the games do allow you to do that. There are many online gaming communities right now. The Star Wars universe is one, and the World of Warcraft is another, and the Minecraft worlds are kind of an interesting spin-off of that. There are many different types of games that are multi-person, very engaging, and have a lot of the elements of reality or simulation built into them. And those are virtual worlds. What we're really adding to the mix today is the ability to put on a 3D headset and walk around inside a space that doesn't even exist. And a number of us have already done that. We put on the headset, we interact with things in our living room or in worlds such as a spacecraft or a barren planet or a forest without ever leaving the comfort of our chair. There are many places today where you can go and play those games, and they're making big money because people are fascinated with games, fascinated with the ability to move around in a different world and do things that you might never be able to do otherwise without consequence. So you can go in and raid a city or lead an army or blow something up or whatever you want to do, and it doesn't do any harm. And we found that people playing in virtual worlds will often learn to cheat and do things behind other people's backs or even cooperate, raise armies, sell and buy and trade. And so some of those things have started to leak over into the real world as well. And a great illustration of that is the Pokemon craze that's hit people just lately. We see that they have their cell phones or similar devices, their tablets, and they're running around out in the streets, out in the woods, out up and down private properties sometimes, looking for things that don't exist. synthetic animals, fictional creatures, and they're getting points for finding and capturing these creatures. And some of them get so engaged in it, they become very irate and upset when their actions collide with the real world. Traffic trying to get through, people not wanting people in their yard, that sort of thing. So we've come to the point where we realize that using simple devices such as your cell phone and also virtual reality goggles, 3D glasses, we can create worlds that don't exist and write them over the existing world. With those glasses, with those devices, you can see things that aren't there. And we do it by mapping the virtual world over the coordinates of the real world. So there is a Microsoft 3D or hologram sort of environment that you can get into these days with a pair of glasses. You turn it on, it maps the space of your living room or your house, and it throws game characters in there, and then you run around in your own house and shoot at them or capture them or chase them. And it literally overlays the 3D images over your rooms and over your belongings. So this is an interesting step. We're creating worlds that are a mixed state reality where the simplest shapes of our world can be substituted or written over by complicated or other functional things in the game world. There are video game parks that have basically cardboard or plywood hallways with boxes, pipes, and very simple things, all basically painted gray. And when you put the headset on, overlaid on them is this rich, detailed spacecraft environment, perhaps, or a bunch of hallways in a building. And when you reach out and touch the objects in the game, you're touching just a bare plastic pipe or a flat plywood wall, but to your eyes, you're seeing the elements of the game. So you really can get in and run around with other players in this virtual environment. Now, there's an interesting thing we can do, and that is we can create a simulation of something, let's say a pendulum, and put this in a virtual world, and then we can put an interface in place that reads the position, the movement of the pendulum, and has it affect something in the real world. And when it does that, it can read the results from the real world and feed it back to the virtual world, so that something you do affects something in the virtual world, and something in the virtual world does affect something back in the real world, perhaps you. This is called a mixed state reality, where the results of reality and the virtual actually worked together to create a hybrid, a mixed state world. Now imagine, just as you have different channels on your television, being able to change stations and see different programs you want, people will very surely end up with a number of channels with different VRs or virtual worlds on them, virtual realities, and be able to pick the one they want and overlay it on the real world. Now, this sort of functionality comes with a price. We remember television and all the ads and the thought that when cable would come along, there wouldn't be any advertisements. And then when cable came along, what did they do is they sold advertising time on cable channels as well. And then before you know it, cable television had just as many or more ads than regular broadcast television. When we got on the internet at first, it wasn't an advertising channel. Now everywhere you go, the spam in your emails, the ads that show up on sites you go to, we are inundated with sales and advertising. Why would we not imagine that when we could put on those 3D glasses and get into our mixed state world where we're walking around in the real world, but there's information in place such as phone numbers, addresses, maybe names of people floating over their heads as they walk by us on the street, or license plate numbers on vehicles, any sort of information that you can imagine can be overlaid on the real world with these glasses, and every advertiser goes, oh yeah, this is where I want my ads. And it becomes very insidious. They can look at you, they can find things they know about you by surfing through your information, sifting through it in the cloud, whatever you posted online, and tagging you. And now they know exactly what ads to target you with. And as you walk through your life or drive through your life with your 3D glasses on, you're going to see those targeted ads all around you. So the mixed state between reality and fiction is becoming a real problem. Now, don't get me wrong, there are great benefits to be derived from virtual reality and its effect that it can have on the real world. And anyone who has one of those cell phone applications for astronomy knows that you go outside at night, you hold your cell phone over your head, and wherever you move it, the map of the sky is overlaid and labeled on the real sky. You can see and identify objects in the sky in real time. What a wonderful application. And how great would it be when you're driving down the road to actually see the street numbers of the buildings you're going by and what businesses are in it? Because right now I can tell you, if you've had to drive anywhere without a GPS and you're trying to find a certain street number, it can be nearly impossible because the things are usually too small or hidden, or you just can't see them. So again, there are some real benefits, but there are real costs as well. We're going to have to examine what our intentions are, how we tend to use this technology, and where it's going. But we also have to recognize the fact that people who do a lot of gaming are going to retreat into a less and less real world. There are some other things that come from the virtual world that can become very real in another way. You know that you can see certain artifacts or machines or characters in a virtual world that don't exist in the real world. But when we combine that with 3D printing, something amazing happens. There are already people who are taking the artifacts from video games and printing 3D models of them in the real world, and some of them, hackers particularly, are adding electronics and sensors and making them actually functional devices. Now just imagine being able to take the information of a fictional plant that lives on some alien planet in a virtual world, run it through your 3D bioprinter, and actually print a living plant like that. You actually could print a houseplant that has the properties, the structure, and the appearance of some plant in this fictional universe, this virtual world. Bring it into reality so that your printer acts literally as a gateway between worlds, the unreal and the real. And your printed plant? Feed me, Seymour. We've already seen now that they have synthetic organisms, cyborg organisms, that are made from some living tissue, some robotic parts, some silicone for a body. And these organisms are actually living cyborgs, cybernetic organisms, a hybrid of the machine and the biological. What would stop us from going even further? Once we get AI online, you know that any character from any one of those fictions could be printed into a hybrid organic and robotic body and brought to life. So we're at the threshold of an amazing, astounding world, filled with possibilities of disaster and hope. So what we have to do is pay strict attention to what our intentions are. Because whatever we intend, we're reaching a world where it can be made real, whether we like it or not. Remember, when your wishes are fulfilled, you often find they aren't what you thought they would be. Now, our ability to enter a virtual world has actually grown considerably in recent times. Some scientists have invented subcutaneous sensors that can be planted within your skin, and in some cases hooked directly to the nervous system, that allow you to receive a signal that triggers your nerve endings. And these can be coupled to software so that experiences in the virtual world, such as something touching your hand, or when you reach out to touch something that isn't there, you get the sensation of actually touching it. Those sensations can be transmitted from a virtual model into your nervous system. And at that point, you have a stage of mixed reality where something that doesn't exist actually registers in your sensory environment. Not just what you're hearing and seeing, but what you're actually feeling. And it won't be long before they'll plug into your sense of smell. So the virtual world and entering it, these things are happening now, and we're seeing advances that will allow people who can design any sort of an environment you want to create a world so convincing and realistic. Some people may never want to leave it. That's one of the hazards of virtual reality. So we're now in a world where anything you can dream of can be created as a virtual world, and the sensory input from those fake worlds can very soon become so convincing and realistic that it will be like the real thing, and that world is now about to be encroached upon by advertisers en masse. They're going to be advertising things that they think you want to see and buy. And we need to know, how do we draw the line between those synthetic creatures inside those worlds, how many of them will be allowed out into our world, and how we're going to make some sort of system to control that. So what's really spurring the growth of virtual worlds? Why would people create virtual worlds? And in the past, a lot of it was gaming and simulations. And a lot of serious work is done with simulations. And as we also know, doctors and surgeons in practice are often using VR, virtual reality, to bring medical practice to their hands without actually having to touch a cadaver. And in many cases, they can create a 3D model of the human body, and there are many of them online right now, which can be used with the virtual reality glasses and surgeons' tools to open the body and explore the interior and what's inside, and to practice their surgical skills, identifying and practices. A lot of times, people don't realize how much practice it takes to recognize the structure of the human body. When you see a drawing of it or something, it's completely different from seeing the actual 3D solid or the model of it. And so, using virtual reality models, doctors can practice their procedures before they actually operate, before they ever put a scalpel to the flesh. In some cases, these models have allowed surgeons to practice surgery using robotics at a distance. There are some cases when an expert surgeon just cannot be there, and we do have surgical robots that allow them to teleoperate, to operate on their patients at a distance. And this has been done. So virtual reality does have some very real benefits and applications in the real world. Another one is, let's say you're decommissioning a nuclear reactor. You don't have to actually be present for it. You send the robots in, and you put on a set of gloves or other sort of interface system that allows you to remotely operate the robots as if you were there in the core of the reactor. So we can send robots into the dangerous zones and keep our experts out here where they're safe. So VR has a lot of excellent things that it can do for us that would be very, very difficult to do in any other manner. But many of the virtual realities we see are not created for science or research or even industrial applications. Many of them are the result of the outgrowth of games and other forms of entertainment. Many people have played a game on their computers called The Sims. And The Sims, which is short for simulations, is basically a bunch of synthetic people in an environment that you control, and you set up the different things about their lives and what they're going to do. And some of them do certain jobs and some do other things, and you can control some of them. You can train them with skills, and they become adept at doing things. You're basically putting a small number of people to work in a simulated environment and having them do something, live their lives, for instance. There are also virtual models such as SimCity, where you can try your hand at designing, developing, and operating a city. And some of them have gotten actually pretty good. There are city managers and mayors who've actually used SimCity as a planning tool for their own cities in the real world. What gets interesting is when you see the number of virtual worlds that have been created for entertainment purposes, and some of them are simply to have a social hangout and a place to be. Second Life, InWorlds, Twinity, Virtual World, Active Worlds, 3D Chat. This is an interesting one. All of the things that I mentioned are virtual worlds that you can go to online and spend some time in there. But 3D Chat is an application that you put at the front end of your chat program, and it allows you to chat with people all over the world like you normally would. But instead of simply typing text back and forth, you actually have an avatar, a second self inside the computer, and so do they. And they interact as if they were live. So it's a little more like a hybrid between a video phone and a 3D game, which can be quite entertaining on its own. There are a number of others. Gojio, which is made in India, Kaniva, Onverse, OS Grid, they're incorporated. These are all virtual worlds, and they have interesting features. For instance, your virtual characters can have jobs, can own land, have apartments or homes, decorate them and build them, and other virtuals, well, actually other live humans, can enter these virtual worlds and visit you in those places. So it gives you a forum in which to interact and play and build and be creative, which is very interesting on its own. Some people simply don't get along well with real people, but if you put the element of virtual reality in there, they tend to be much more comfortable because it's almost as if it's a layer or a shield between you and the rest of society in some ways. And yet, even though you might not be able to face the actual people face to face, there's something very different about meeting these people in a VR. For one thing, you have no idea if this person is a male or a female, young or old. There's a joke that went around quite a few years ago. On the internet, nobody even knows you're a dog. And this is actually very true in many of the virtual worlds. Some people are very socially inept or simply don't want to face other people, and they will put a layer of fantasy between themselves and others. But when you interact with people at all, you are revealing things about yourself. And I would say that while they may not be able to see your physical characteristics, or anything real about you in that sense. What they're really learning is what's in your mind and your heart. You're telling them things with the interactions that you have that you might not have intended, and that can be far more revealing about who you truly are than what you look like or how tall you are. I think that people are not aware of the channels of information that we have to have in order to communicate effectively with others. And when you create virtual worlds, you're playing a game with those channels. And some of that information will come through loud and clear, and it's easy also to be misinterpreted or misunderstood just as well. But one thing is very clear. Many times people create virtual worlds for entertainment. And sometimes it isn't game playing or visiting with others, but sometimes it's to live out a fantasy. In many of these worlds, they will create space battles or remote islands or huge architectural structures such as castles or anything you could imagine. It's often been said that sex is what built the internet and made it what it is, and I think that in a large part that is true. The ability to share information freely with others that you might not want your mother to see. That's been a driving force behind videotapes and behind chat rooms and all sorts of information. And it's no less true about the internet. There are a lot of sites that are very frowned upon today that were quite popular in times past. And yet there's a whole dark web side to the internet that most people are not even aware of. This is no less true about the virtual worlds. There's one called Eros Island, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's basically tailored for sex fantasies and interacting with people that you may never meet in the real world. Or, again, it's all about fantasy. You don't know what they're truly like. What really makes the virtual world so interesting is the ability to use what's known as a haptic interface. And let me take that back a stage. We're limited to the number of sensory channels that we can get over the internet or over any artificial medium. And typically we use sight and sound, two of our senses. You can't normally get a sense of touch over the internet. You certainly would have a tough time getting a sense of smell or of taste. But there are inroads being made into that. Most of the haptic interfaces that are generated right now are basically things that give you feedback in other channels, tactile channels particularly. Imagine if you were doing surgery in a remote and you have no way of knowing how hard the scalpel is pushing against the flesh, or how much pressure is being applied, or whether an area is resistant to your touch, or whether it's firm or loose. You need to know things about tissue properties. You need to know about mechanical properties. And in times past, this was very difficult, but they do have systems where you put your hands in a glove box, and there are force feedback devices. So whatever you manipulate, there is a sense of resistance or fighting back. Now, what's interesting is we could build a glove, for instance, that has built into its fabric tiny devices that will vibrate like piezoelectric devices. They can give you a sense of texture, or they can buzz or whine or tick whenever your fingers are supposed to encounter a surface or some effect. And we also have devices that can make a surface hot or cold electrically on demand. So you can transmit quite a bit of information in those three channels right there. Imagine a whole body suit that has actuators that push back with resistance and has all of these inputs for your tactile senses such as hot and cold and pressure and vibration. Imagine an entire outfit that puts you suspended in free space and allows you to interact in all directions with these sensory inputs. And your software, your program, your VR program, could actually supply all this information. We already have a treadmill called an omni-tread, and no matter what direction you walk in, it walks back to keep you stationary in the center. It's used in a lot of first-person shooter games where you go into a combat simulation, for instance, so that you're essentially staying in the center of the room no matter what direction you walk. The treadmill automatically moves back in the opposite direction, and you can walk forever in all directions inside the confines of the video game. Now, what really adds a real channel of information to this is the ability to create an interactive environment called a dynamic overlay. What a dynamic overlay does is it takes the map of the real world and the map of your video game, and it makes the two match in some respect. The Pokemon Go craze was driven by the fact that they could use GPS information, and they could program the locations of things that you would use your cell phone or your pocket device or even headset goggles to locate. So as you walked around, you could see things that weren't really there, but they were in this Pokemon game. And many virtual worlds are reaching a point where that can be done quite easily. So successful VR games are going to be created so that they overlay the real world well enough, with enough correspondence, that you can see something that isn't there and interact. So when you have your personal device, such as a cell phone or headset, it gives you the window, the method of interaction that allows you to see what's going on in this virtual space. When you add haptic interfaces, you now have the ability to actually reach out and touch somebody. And this is something that's been lacking for a while. But it's growing, and it's growing in complexity. And as I mentioned in a previous episode of Talk Universe, we also have seen that people have developed sensors, or I should say sensory transmitters, that will fit into the skin. They're subcutaneous. These are electronic devices that, when planted, interface directly with your nervous system. And you can send signals to them that stimulate the nerve endings to create the sensation of touch or heat or pressure or whatever. This is interesting because it could go both ways. If you could read information from a glove you're wearing or even from these devices in your skin, that data could be transmitted to somebody else or to the game. So we have the ability to create, in the near future, a very realistic simulation. And with similar technology, we could easily get into smell and taste as well as touch and sight and sound. When we reach the point when a game or a virtual world can have you in complete immersion, it could be very difficult to tell it apart from reality. And we'd have to put some sort of safeguards in place for that. And at some point, it's not going to be as simple as putting some sensors in your skin. It's going to invoke connections directly to the brain. Now, as far as that goes, we've already got laboratory results showing that telepathy of a sort can be done between two organisms, where one senses and thinks something, and that information is transmitted to the brain of the other. How much more realistic would the game become when you're able to transmit sensations directly into your brain? So this is where we stand with it, and we're not far from a sort of revolution into a synthetic world. And it's probably one from which a lot of people will never quite emerge. It's going to take a lot of thinking about the addictive level of this sort of an environment. And when you're able to design your own addictive environments like this, you may never leave the house again. Now, there are pluses and minuses to this. I can understand the draw of being able to transport yourself to work with the flick of a switch or even a thought, and be able to do your job right there, and then be able to go afterwards to any place in the world and enjoy any setting you can imagine. But one of the things that seems to be lost in the translation is the fact that much of what we are and who we are depends on learning how to overcome real-world difficulties. There is an element of character that will not develop if you don't have the sorts of objectives and stumbling blocks that real-world life presents to us. But as I mentioned a little earlier, one of the things that's coming our way is not just the overlaying of a virtual world on the real world, but mixed-state virtual realities, or mixed-state realities. This is where objects of the real world and the virtual world interact. They interact in a way in which they influence each other, and one will not act the same in the real world without the presence of those elements of the virtual world. It is as if we have taken the ability to create a ghost, an image, and make it react with the real world as if it were alive or real. And conversely, the things in the real world can change and affect those things in the virtual world. But one of the things that I haven't talked about yet, and it's this, is that there are some very, very real effects from some of the things that happen in virtual worlds, and many of those are based on personal interactions, societal actions. Things that happen in virtual space have an actual effect on the real world. Many times it's because of personal feelings and affairs with virtual characters. Some of them are not actual human beings, but are software. Interaction with characters that is so interesting and so realistic and so convincing that a person will withdraw from normal personal relationships and find themselves in a position where they're interacting with their imaginary friend, so to speak, far more than they are in actual personal relationships in the real world. And this has caused a number of troubles. But we also see other things that can happen, effects from the virtual world coming out of the real world and affecting us in ways that we didn't imagine. And many times this happens in something as simple as stock market trading, projecting what will happen in the market, and then a flurry of buying or selling ensues that changes the values of stocks or how they perceive them in the real world, and can often end up with companies making huge bursts of profit or suddenly being destroyed because of a whisper, an opinion, or the product of some digital figment of our imagination. And when we start adding artificial intelligence into the mix, everything changes. Okay, so we have an interview with a fellow who's got a lot of experience in video gaming and VR. His family made their main business in the biomedical industry, building equipment that did histological and tissue analysis, mostly for biopsies and that sort of thing. And presently, he's engaged in sales and in consulting a little bit with video game and VR companies. So his name is Martin Hacker-Mullen, and he's our guest for the show. And Martin, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Certainly, and we've got a lot of questions about VR that I think people would be fascinated to know the answers of. Well, first of all, in your opinion, what do you see as being a VR?
Well, as of recently, I'd say that a virtual reality is, people would see it as a headset, brings up new worlds that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise. But really, I think you could even be so far as to say role-playing games or an internet persona, just kind of living in a world that isn't actually this physical world.
And I know that Second Life also fits that bill pretty well. And as I mentioned earlier in the segment, there's probably about a couple of dozen of them out there that are pretty popular. Of the most popular ones, of course, recently have been the game sort of overlays that step right into the front of reality. And the Pokemon Go craze that's been so popular recently. What do you think about that?
I think it's a really awesome game. I personally enjoy it a lot. It's a good way for me and my friends to get together, go out, and actually have fun outside for once rather than sitting inside around a screen, something like that. I think it's a really good way to bring a community together that was generally pretty introverted to begin with. So I've had a really good experience with it. I've got nothing but good things to say.
Well, that's good, and you're right. It does get people to do something a little more physical. I know with the Wii systems, they try to get people to exercise a bit, get some physical activity. Yeah. And in fact, people were actually slinging the little baton and hitting the windows sometimes. So
breaking TVs, things like that.
Exactly. They had to put the wrist strap on them to prevent that from happening. And so the Pokemon Go thing actually gets you outside in the fresh air and the sunlight, and sometimes on other people's property or jamming traffic. But do you see the Pokemon Go as a virtual reality or a virtual world? What do you see it as?
Well, what they're calling it is an augmented reality, and I think that's a really good way to put it. It's not really a VR or it's not this necessarily this reality, but it's kind of meshing the two together to create this thing where it's using your GPS and using your camera to put these creatures in front of you or to put these battles in front of you. And I honestly think that's almost better than a virtual reality. To kind of mesh the two worlds together is something I'd never seen before.
Well, I would imagine that in the near future we're going to see numerous channels like that, where you can pretty much use your device, select a channel, and play a game that overlays the real world. But there are collisions that occur when this happens as well. Tell me about some of the problems like the traffic jams and other things that have happened.
Yeah, I've definitely seen people playing while they're driving, stopping on the side of the road because maybe there's a rare Pokemon there, or maybe they can't quite get to the Pokestop to get new Pokeballs, things like that. It definitely has caused problems. I know when the State House still had its Pokestops, there would be hundreds of people outside of the State House every day in Columbia, and I know that can cause a big problem for the people that work there, having all of these kids on their cell phones crowding the steps and getting in the way.
Do you think there could ever be any legal issues? I know there were some talks about people suing people for trespassing on property, and it looks like bringing a lot of people together like that is kind of an assembly. Does anybody ask any questions about whether you needed a license for that sort of assembly, or is it just sort of a spontaneous thing, or what?
I'm not really sure. I know going out in groups before, sometimes we'll be out late at night playing and police will stop us and ask us, hey, what are you doing? They see that we're all playing Pokemon on our phones. They just laugh and go away. And I know there are problems with trespassing as well. Some of the Pokestops I've experienced are in people's backyards, and I'm not trying to hop somebody's fence just to get some Pokeballs, but I know some people are a little more gutsy than I am.
So there could actually be problems. I know that, and this is a little off track, I realize that in the past there were some predictions made. I did a show many years ago with Art Bell on Coast, and in it we talked about the virtual world becoming a much bigger presence in the real world. And one of the things he mentioned was that virtual characters were becoming much more lifelike, more interactive. And the addition of AI makes that even more so, artificially intelligent characters. And it was predicted that there would actually be legal problems and divorces over interactions with fictional characters, fictional affairs. And it was stated between 2008 and 2011, there was an 81% increase in filings for divorces and separations based on online affairs. What do you think about the fact that a lot of people are going online to chat rooms or VR rooms and getting involved with people personally? How do you see that?
Um, I don't think it's really the best thing. I can't. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that. I've made friends online, people that I've never actually met before. Some of them through video games or just through internet forums, things like that. And most of the people there are pretty tame. They're just regular people, you know. Uh, but to ruin your entire marriage or something like that because of somebody you met online, that is something I'm against. It's just kind of breaking moral code.
Sure.
Kind
So,
of.
so you see it as cheating if somebody goes online and
Definitely. I mean, if you're having, even if it's text-based, a sexually explicit relationship with another person, or even a romantic relationship with someone else, even if it's just text-based or video chat-based, that's can be considered cheating to most people.
so what if instead, and this is a hypothetical case, suppose the character that this person is interacting with is fictional. Suppose it is a script or an AI. How do you feel about that? What comes to mind?
What comes to mind, there's a bunch of sim dating video games. There's a YouTube channel called The Game Theorist. They had a long, in-depth video series about this, about how sim dating is a norm in some cultures because, well, mainly they were touching on Japan, how in Japan the workday is so busy and they don't really have a whole lot of time to come home and have a life, and they can open up a Nintendo DS or turn on their computer and they've got a virtual girlfriend or a virtual wife right there that doesn't cause any problems. It's the perfect relationship to them. So in that sense, I think really that might be okay. But if you've already got a real life going on and you're trying to get this virtual life as an escape from your real life, then maybe I think you need to reevaluate your real life, try to make some changes there.
I think that's a good way of putting it. And this is the other factor. As virtual worlds become more engaging and more complicated and in-depth, people are going to spend more and more time out of reality and unreality. And I already see this as a trend. I mean, even when video games started getting really engaging, people started dropping out of social interaction. And now, anyone who is over 40 who walks down the street and sees groups of people hunched over a little glass and metal thing in their hand, oblivious to the clouds, the birds, the traffic, and their whole life is in their palm of their hand, in front of their eyes, at the tap of a few fingers. It seems to be a violation of normality to many people. Now, I know that it's more accepted today because it is so widespread. How do you feel a balance can be struck between the virtual world and the real world?
A balance. I'm not really sure. I feel like this is probably as close as the balance is going to get, to be honest with you.
This is the Darwin solution?
Yeah. I mean, I know even a lot of my friends are against Pokemon Go because it takes away from reality. That's, what they're saying. But in the defense of a lot of people is that it's not really taking away to reality, it's adding to reality. It's kind of making reality more exciting. And I don't necessarily think that playing Pokemon Go is unacceptable, being buried in your phone and getting outside and going to, national landmarks, things like that, because you're not, at least with most people I've seen, you're not going to be completely consumed into the game. You are going to be going out and you are going to be looking at what's around you. And that's one of the things that Pokemon Go makes clear from the loading screen is be alert of your surroundings. And I know that's more of a safety thing, but if you actually are alert of your surroundings, you'll see the world's not so bad and you don't need Pokemon Go to make it cool to go outside. I think it's kind of something that'll teach you to enjoy the world around you through something else that you already enjoy that wasn't the world around you.
Don't you think sometimes that the warning at the startup screen is just like the side on the box of cigarettes that says smoking can eat your lungs?
Yeah. Yeah, that's one way to put it if you wanted to.
Well, let me ask you another thing, and this is a fascinating subject, really. I know that there are a lot of times when I'm driving down the road and I'm trying to find an address, and you cannot see the numbers on the building, the street numbers, and an augmented reality would allow you to overlay a lot of data that you need on the real world.
Yeah.
But I also see that when this happens, the same thing will happen that happened with the phone book. Years ago, you had to look up a number in a phone book, 6 pounds of white paper, and then when it went online, you could put in almost any parameter and you could find the phone number. Now it is a struggle to find a phone number online. All the services have been taken over and you have to pay to use them. I think that there's a danger here that when we go to augmented worlds, we're besieged by advertising very quickly. What do you think about that?
Ooh, I don't really know. I haven't thought of that before.
You see, one of the things that I've always seen is every time there's a change in how communication is delivered, is it becomes fertile ground for advertisers.
Okay.
And I know that anytime I write an email about a subject or I search for something online, for the next 3 or 4 weeks, those products are on every page I go to. They've got this tailored advertising coming to me. I feel that it's a real danger that the same thing could happen. I mean, already, I was approached a few years ago about a project to build a kiosk for malls that could detect a specific cell phone and then look up that person's data and then send advertising to that person. And I refused to participate because I saw how many dark applications there were for that sort of thing, and yet I'm already seeing that sort of thing now. And any thoughts about that?
Well, especially for that kiosk, I can definitely see it as an invasion of privacy, and definitely with your computer, it's almost as if every website you're going on is installing spyware, trying to figure out what you do and who you are to kind of tailor these things to you. And while I don't necessarily think advertising is a bad thing, I think that breaking into people's personal files to see how to advertise to them, that's definitely a security breach, and that could be a risk for a lot of people.
Well, now, isn't it true that a lot of times when we agree to use a service, we don't read the agreement? We just check, oh, yeah, I agree, and we download the thing, not knowing we've signed away access to our microphone and our camera or our coordinate data.
It's actually funny that you mentioned that. One of the reasons I began reading it was there's an episode of South Park that was about user agreements, which is, kind of a funny thing to bring up with this, but people don't read the user agreements for the iPads, and then they get turned into the human centipedes. And I was thinking, well, that's a total exaggeration, but what if there is something terrible that I'm missing in the fine print? So now anytime I'm installing something or buying something, if there's a user agreement, I'm sure to read every line to see if I actually want to go through with what I've been doing.
So the cost of being able to use that flashlight application on your cell phone is probably about 3 hours of legal reading.
Yeah, something like that.
Boy, what a weird development. So now, here's another thing. Right now, the AI is rather tame in games. Most of it is targeted for, let's say you're in a Battlefield first-person shooter, and you're overlaid with some other friends who have been, let's say you're online in one of these World War games, and I won't name them specifically, but I'll just give you the general hint.
Yeah.
And you're in there with 3 or 4 of your buddies, and you start walking around in here, and you see that there are enemies in here that are not human, and they have certain ways that they interact with you. They can spot you, they can hide, they can snipe, they can run around. So the AI that we see is targeted AI. It is for a specific task. Now, we're seeing a lot of developments, very rapid developments, in fact, in AI personalities and how they respond. And don't you think it's possible pretty soon that you could enter a VR and it would be completely populated with AIs and you wouldn't be able to tell them from the actual living people?
That's very possible. I know, I can't remember exactly which video game it was with, but the developers were tracking how people are playing the game, so that when you go into the horde mode scenarios and you're playing against AI computers, you can't tell that they're AI. They start to think like real people. They start mimicking your moves and the moves of your friends and the people that you're playing with online. And so it's already really gotten to the point that you can't tell the difference between AI and real people. And I know even with some of the old Halo games that I used to play online really heavily, people would program computers to play exactly like them so that they don't always have to be playing their game to get experience. They can get a computer to play exactly like them, and you can't tell the difference.
Yeah, there is something there. And that doesn't mean that they're thinking, but it means that they're at least acting like a person.
Yeah.
And we're going to take a break right here. So we'll be back with Talk Universe in just a few moments. Okay, so we're back with our interview with Martin Hacker-Mullen, and we're going to get this wrapped up pretty quickly. There's some fascinating things to know about this, and we're going to get down to the Singularity Watch in our book recommendation. Martin, I did have a couple of questions. I've noticed that lately there are a lot of stock market models that have been played out in virtual worlds, and then they are actually growing AIs in stock market simulations and using them to make predictions about how to profit or lose in the stock market. And these overlays on the real world actually have a direct effect, like causing stocks to crash or stocks to boom. What do you think about using augmented realities or virtual worlds to affect outcomes in the real world?
I think if you can manipulate it, that's a very great power to use augmented reality and virtual realities to manipulate the real world. But to go to Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility, and that's actually something that's borderline terrifying, to know that someone can come up with a computer program that can actually change everything in the real world. Especially with things like stock markets, as you and I were talking during the break. That's a really cutthroat market. Those are things that don't really have morals. And another thing that we mentioned, everybody's seen Terminator, and that's where it starts to get really scary. If you have an extremely advanced, very smart computer science mind going on, and it doesn't really have a boundary, that can prove to be catastrophic.
Yeah, I can see where we've got a number of mixed state realities, which I mentioned a little earlier in the show. And that's where we have a VR model of something and a real world model of something, and they work together to produce what's known as a mixed state reality, so that the contents and actions of the virtual world and the real world interrelate. What do you think of as perhaps the greatest danger in using a mixed state or augmented reality? What do you think that might be?
I think the greatest danger could be that it could be dangerous to human beings, maybe in a violent sense or just in an overpowering sense. If you have these supercomputers that are getting to the point where they're smarter than your regular person, they can start kind of hurting people around, and thinking for people.
In the auspices of a game, perhaps, making people respond.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what comes to my mind, and maybe this is off base, but I don't know. I don't think anybody alive remembers the War of the Worlds thing with Orson Welles. Basically, they had a radio show that was done as a fake news broadcast, and people believed it, and they panicked, thinking we actually were being invaded by Martians during this War of the Worlds broadcast. And what I see is the potential of combining a virtual world that is a close analog of reality, and then leveraging that and causing a panic. It's sort of like the War of the Worlds panic. What do you think the possibility of that is?
I think it's a very high possibility. That's not something that seems very hard at all, to be honest.
In other words, cyber terrorism could extend very easily to the virtual and spill over into the real.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of possibilities of that in just about anything we can think of. But, okay, that, I say, is probably one of the most terrifying aspects of virtual worlds colliding with reality. And, we've seen recent things like the EPA accidentally opening the valve on mine tailings and poisoning millions of gallons in a river. Mm-hmm. And then we've seen cases where, companies will do something that in the simulation look good, but in the real world don't work out so well. Yeah. We're at a point, we're just at the very beginning of this. I think we have an awful lot to learn, and we need to get some controls on it right away. And I don't mean legal controls, because anybody can break a law. I mean, we have to figure out some way of red flagging something if it looks bad. Some sort of an indicator, like the objects in mirror are closer than they appear. Yeah. Something along those lines. Any closing thoughts about this, Martin?
I think the advancements with virtual reality and augmented reality are both really amazing things. as a tech nerd, I'm all for things like that. And if it's going to only benefit people, then that's definitely something I'm for. I know with virtual reality being a big video game platform lately, I'm in full support of that. But the manipulation of it is scary. If people can turn it into something that it's not supposed to be, into something dangerous, into something that puts people at risk, that's something that maybe just like there's the FDA, you might need to make a monitoring branch of the government to make sure that it doesn't get too out of hand.
That's not a bad idea. Perhaps if it were something in civil authority hands, not government hands, but
Yeah,
it has to be a coalition between the people.
yeah, definitely.
And, I mean, that makes the most sense to me.
Hmm.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time on the show. Martin, it's been a great interview, and I
been
hope
fun.
to have you back again soon.
I'd love that.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So this was a great interview, and Martin had a lot of very interesting and salient things to say, things that I think have a very good bearing on what's happening with the virtual worlds. And we're seeing a lot of things change radically. And there are no exceptions to the things that we see in the normal world. They seem to spill right over into our virtual worlds very, very rapidly. Many of the virtual worlds are based on crime or warfare or pornography, rather than many of the more positive human aspects that we really need to be focusing on. And I think in part of it is because we often have a dark side. We want to explore these things, and we want to do it in a way that doesn't spill over into the real world. There are a lot of fantasies of fighting or winning or battling that we go through because, let's face it, we are organisms, and we have been based on a survival mode for all of our existence. And it's very difficult to get out of that. And virtual worlds allow us an opportunity to do those things, but understand something. When we abstain from that sort of behavior in the real world, we're tempering and developing our personalities. When we take these virtual worlds as outlets, we may be developing a side of ourselves that we really need to learn how to eradicate, not focus on. But that being said, one of the things that I see is that when we start playing extremely violent or questionable sorts of games or following those activities in a virtual world, if there are other real-world participants in there, they're learning from us, and it isn't the private fantasy world that we might think that it might be. Remember that everything that you do online is monitored and saved, and it never goes away. There are marks you're making that won't be eradicated, that will catch up with you, perhaps, at some future time. So what's the solution to that? It's very hard to say. I mean, I'm sure that anything that we say, anything we do, could be held against us at some future point, and virtual worlds are no exception to that. We think that we have a new playground, but we live in a world where everything is monitored much more closely and in much more detail than it ever was before. Now, for my Singularity Watch, I'd like to point out that there are a number of companies developing at this moment in-the-eye contact lenses that have virtual or augmented reality, and that's very important because right now, we are essentially stuck with using a headset or a video screen, and what's really coming around is a virtual reality contact lens system that goes right in your eye and projects the equivalent of a 240-inch TV seen at 10 feet, making a very high-resolution display that overlays the world for you. Now, the ones that I see right away are a joint venture between DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and a technology company called Innovega. And basically what they're looking at is getting this transparent display right into your eye. But they're not yet available. That's an eye-optic setup, which is what it's called, and it has two components. One is the contact lens, and one is a set of glasses that goes over it. And it gives them the ability to track where you're looking and project the display to match. Oh, this is great, and it's a clear sign the Singularity is much closer than we might have thought. With the Bluetooth connectivity that you have for earbuds for stereo, and then this visual overlay, you can actually get an extremely convincing virtual reality or virtual world immersion experience for an extremely minimal set of hardware. And now to point out that there are pluses and minuses of the virtual worlds, I've got two books for my book recommendation this time around. And one of them is in a little more positive vein, and it is Virtual Worlds as a Collaborative Platform for Virtual Teams by Purcell Barton. This book talks all about how you can get a number of people, participants in a project, together in a virtual space. You're extending the two-dimensional text base interaction to a virtual real-world 3D interactive environment that anybody can join anywhere in the world and work together on a project. What an amazing way of doing it. The other side of the coin is a book called Virtual Worlds and Criminality. Now, in this one, which is by Kai Cornelius and Dieter Hermann, published in 2011, in this book, they look at how all these virtual worlds have emerged, such as Second Life and Twinity and Entropia Universe, and they look at how we have taken our human actions over to the virtual world, the dream world. And it really is a place where fraud and other criminal activities are growing very rapidly. How do we combat that? How do we counter it? I really don't know. But we have to be aware that these things do exist and they're happening right under our noses. So those are the two book titles that I'm recommending this week. We've had our Singularity Watch, we've had our book recommendations, and we had a great interview, and I want to do a few closing notes real quickly here. I want to point out that there are a number of what's called development kits available now for VRs, and it really is what was called in the Aboriginal stories the dream time. And to cover that briefly, the dream time was a state when the world was void and formless, and concepts lived and moved freely. All creatures of sorts you can't imagine lived in the dream time. And when the world became solid, those things were trapped in the dream world, and we became the real world. The legends go on to say that later the dream time will return. Now, as strange as it seems, that's exactly in the position we are today. We're creating the dream time, and we're putting it in a form where it can come out and affect our real world. Right now, there are a number of systems that will do that for you. There are development kits that allow you to build your own dream worlds. The most popular VR goggles, a tool for seeing in 3D and moving around in those environments, are probably the Google VR, the Google Glass system, or the Oculus Rift system. There are a number of different systems out there. There are the Razer systems, OS VR, and you can find any of these online. Just take a few minutes and look them up. Basically, a development kit allows you to feed data into the glasses, such as your virtual world you've created, and to get data out of the glasses, such as which direction you're looking and what you're doing. And if you look online, you'll see almost all of them are sold out right away. The development kits are extremely popular because game developing people are popping up in larger and larger numbers all over the world. They're taking advantage of the fact that we love fantasies. But it won't stop there. What we think of as the normal movie experience, going to see a movie, is about to change radically. Now, video games, of course, have put us in the driver's seat for a lot of environments that don't actually exist. But now we're seeing a fusion of video games and movie technology and bringing to life scenarios that you literally can walk through or live out in such amazing detail that I don't imagine that any of you who are not gamers have truly imagined just how realistic it can be. Now, I'm all for the development of these virtual worlds in the fact that they can be very productive and they can spur creativity and they can allow us to do things that we normally couldn't. But we're also seeing the fallout of that. We are seeing systems like the stock market programs we talked about that are having immense and not necessarily positive effects on the global economy. We're seeing systems that are becoming so smart that they're displacing people from jobs that have always been held by thinking human beings. We're seeing systems doing diagnosis in the medical industry or the engineering fields and legal field. The legal field is being taken over by artificial intelligences that have on tap the legal expertise, history, and experience of hundreds of years. Any opinion can be rendered on almost any subject in a very brief period of time. The process of exploration in a legal matter can be done by expert systems who can respond to you in voice. You can ask your questions, you can get your answers. This is a huge change in how business has been done, and I don't think it's going to get any easier for the human being who has to go through years of college to learn a trade or learn a skill and then find out that they're unemployable because of some software. Now, how do we make the world more apprehendable to human beings? I don't know that we can. As Charles Osman said in his interview, there's a point where human relevance comes into question. Are we relevant? Have we ever really been relevant, or has it all been an illusion? We feel we have such control over our world, and yet it almost always is an illusion. How fitting is it that we would create worlds of illusion to retreat into? And are we to the point where it's going to be irreversible? What do you think? Is this positive or negative as a whole for society? Join us next week on Talk Universe. I'm your host, Sir Charles Schultz. Thank you for listening.